This isn't some fictional tale I cooked up. This story is real, and it's the most important thing I've ever done in my life. It's the story of how, at 66 years old, I found out that history isn't just something you read about in books. Sometimes you have to write it yourself. The air in the grand hall of the Chicago Union League Club was thick with the scent of old leather, lemon polish, and the cloying perfume of political ambition. I stood near the podium, my hands clasped behind my back, feeling the crispness of the note cards I'd spent a week preparing. This was supposed to be the culmination of my life's work. Governor Wallace Thorne, his silver hair catching the light from the chandeliers, placed a hand on my shoulder, his smile as wide and brilliant as a car salesman's. He leaned in, his voice a low conspiratorial rumble meant only for me. "Arthur, today we make history," he'd said. And then he stepped up to the microphone, cleared his throat, and announced to the assembled press and dignitaries that my beloved, landmark-designated Marquette building, the very place I had spent 40 years preserving, was being officially condemned and scheduled for demolition. He said it with that same brilliant smile, as if he were announcing a cure for cancer, not slitting the throat of a century of Chicago's soul. My note cards fluttered from my numb fingers, scattering across the polished marble floor like dead leaves. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. My name is Arthur Pendleton. For 42 years, I was the chief archivist for the Illinois State Historical Society, a title that sounds far grander than the reality. In practice, it meant I was a glorified custodian of forgotten things. I spent my days in the hushed, climate-controlled silence of the Marquette Building's lower vaults, surrounded by the ghosts of Illinois. My companions were brittle land deeds, the faded ink of Civil War correspondence, microfilm spools containing the entire run of the Chicago Tribune, and boxes upon boxes of personal effects from families whose names were now just engravings on tombstones in Graceland Cemetery. I loved it. It was a quiet life, a life of meticulous order and tangible connection to the past. My wife, Eleanor, used to joke that I was the only man she knew who preferred the company of the dead. She wasn't entirely wrong. After she passed from a swift and merciless bout with cancer 5 years ago, the archives became more than a job. They were my sanctuary. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with whispers of lives lived, of deals made, of secrets kept. The Marquette Building itself was my greatest love affair. An 1895 masterpiece of the Chicago School, its bronze relief panels depicting Jacques Marquette's expedition were to me as beautiful as any Rembrandt. Its Tiffany mosaic rotunda was a cathedral of light and history. I knew every creak in its floors, every secret of its iron cage elevators, every water stain on the ceiling of the sub-basement. I had dedicated my career to securing its future, writing endless grant proposals, lobbying indifferent state senators, and leading tours for schoolchildren whose eyes would glaze over until I showed them the hidden compartment in a 19th century alderman's desk. That's how I met Governor Wallace Thorne. He swept into the Marquette Building 2 years ago on a campaign tour, a whirlwind of charisma and perfectly tailored suits. He wasn't like the other politicians who saw the building as a dusty liability on the state's balance sheet. He saw its story. Or, more accurately, he saw how he could make its story his story. He walked through the rotunda, his voice booming as he spoke of honoring our heritage, of preserving the great monuments of our state for generations to come. He posed for photos with me, his arms slung around my shoulders, calling me a state treasure and the guardian of our collective memory. He promised a massive injection of state funding, enough to finally complete the structural retrofitting the building desperately needed and to digitize our most fragile collections. He made me, and the building, the centerpiece of his Illinois Heritage Initiative. I believed him. I was 64 then, 2 years from a quiet retirement I both dreaded and anticipated. Thorne's promises felt like a final grand validation of my quiet, diligent life. He made me feel seen. He made me feel like my work mattered to someone outside the dusty silence of the vaults. For 2 years, everything seemed to be on track. Preliminary funds were released. Engineers were consulted. Architects drew up beautiful renderings of a restored Marquette building, complete with a state-of-the-art museum wing. Governor Thorne mentioned me by name in speeches. My picture was in pamphlets. I was invited to luncheons and galas at the governor's mansion in Springfield, events where I felt as out of place as a dusty manuscript in a nightclub. I'd stand awkwardly in my best slightly too large suit, nursing a club soda while Thorne worked the room, shaking hands and slapping backs, always with that predator's smile. His chief of staff, a severe-looking man named Marcus Cole, would often shadow him. Cole had dead eyes and a handshake like a cold fish. He looked at me not as a person, but as a prop, an amusing little historical footnote to be utilized for the governor's narrative. My gut told me to be wary of him, but I dismissed it as the natural cynicism of a man who'd spent his life reading the private letters of scoundrels. I chose to trust the governor's dazzling, public persona instead. The invitation to the press conference at the Union League Club arrived on thick, embossed cardstock. It was to be the official announcement of the final, massive phase of the state's funding. Thorne's office had called me personally, asking me to prepare a short speech about the building's historical significance. "The governor wants you right there beside him, Arthur," his secretary had chirped. "He says you're the heart of this whole project." I spent a week on those note cards, polishing every word. I wrote about the architects, Holabird and Roach. I wrote about the building surviving the urban renewal fads of the 50s and 60s. I wrote about the generations of Chicagoans who had passed through its bronze-framed doors. I practiced reading it aloud in my empty apartment, Elena's picture on the mantel, my only audience. I wanted to do the building justice. I wanted to make the governor proud. When I arrived, the energy in the room was electric. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled in notebooks, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Marcus Cole greeted me at the door with a rare, thin smile. "Big day, Arthur. The governor is very excited." He led me to a spot just behind the podium. A few minutes later, Governor Thorne swept in, shaking hands, a king surveying his court. He saw me, winked, and gave me that firm, reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "Ready to make history?" he asked. I nodded, my heart swelling with a pathetic, naive pride. I was a part of something grand, something that would outlive me. Then he stepped to the microphone. The room fell silent. He started with the usual platitudes about fiscal responsibility, about progress, about building a new Illinois. I listened patiently, waiting for my cue. He spoke of the tough decisions leaders must make, the sacrifices required for a brighter future. A knot of unease began to tighten in my stomach. This wasn't the tone of a celebration. This was the tone of an execution. He then mentioned the Illinois Heritage Initiative, and I relaxed for a moment. He talked about its success, but then his voice shifted, becoming grave, somber. "And in that spirit of progress," he said, his eyes scanning the room, "we must sometimes let go of the past to embrace the future." He paused for dramatic effect. "The Marquette building, a noble relic of a bygone era, has, after extensive review, been deemed structurally unsalvageable and a significant drain on taxpayer resources." A collective gasp rippled through the press corps. My blood ran cold. I felt my legs go weak. "Therefore," he continued, his voice ringing with false sincerity, "my office has approved a partnership with a titan of Illinois industry, Vanguard Development, to erect a new state-of-the-art commercial tower on that site. It will generate thousands of jobs and millions in tax revenue. A true monument to the future of this great state." He gestured magnanimously towards a smirking man in the front row whom I vaguely recognized, Preston Holloway, the notoriously ruthless CEO of Vanguard. And then, the final brutal twist of the knife. He turned, looked directly at me, and gave the audience a sad paternal smile. "And I want to personally thank Arthur Pendleton for his decades of service," he announced, as if he were pinning a medal on me. "His work in cataloging the Marquette's treasures will be invaluable as we prepare the site for its new, prosperous chapter. We have, of course, arranged a generous state pension and a full commendation for his retirement, effective immediately." The world tilted. The applause that followed sounded like roaring static in my ears. He was not only killing my building, he was burying me with it. He had used me, paraded me around as the face of his preservation project, only to bring me here, to this public stage, to be the symbol of its destruction. My note card slipped from my grasp, the words I had so carefully crafted now meaningless. He had made history, just as he'd promised. He had made me a fool. The flash of a camera bulb was like a burst of white-hot pain, searing the image of his triumphant, smiling face into my memory forever. In that moment, standing amidst the ruins of my life's work, something inside me didn't just break. It calcified. It turned from grief into something cold, hard, and patient. The days following the announcement were a blur of humiliation. My face was on the front page of the Sun-Times and the Tribune, a picture of bewildered despair next to a beaming Governor Thorne and Preston Holloway shaking hands. The headline read, "Past versus Future. Thorne announces Vanguard Tower on historic Marquette site." They painted me as a sad, doddering old man, a relic unable to accept the march of progress. My phone rang incessantly with calls from genuinely sympathetic colleagues, from opportunistic reporters looking for a tearful quote, and worst of all, from Marcus Cole's office, cheerfully offering to help with my transition into a well-deserved retirement. I didn't answer any of them. I unplugged the phone and sat in the silence of my apartment, the city lights of Chicago twinkling outside my window. Feeling as hollowed out as the building I was about to lose, they gave me 2 weeks to clear out my personal effects from my office in the Marquette. 2 weeks to pack up 42 years of my life. Walking into the building felt like visiting a friend on their deathbed. The usual hushed reverence of the place was gone, replaced by a funereal gloom. My small staff, just 2 part-time assistants and a conservator, looked at me with a mixture of pity and anger. They were losing their jobs too. "I'm so sorry, Sarah Michael," I'd mumbled, unable to meet their eyes. They just shook their heads, telling me it wasn't my fault, but we all knew I had been the governor's champion, the one who had assured them all that the building's future was secure. I had been his pawn, and my foolish trust had cost them dearly. My office was a cramped, book-lined space on the 3rd floor overlooking Dearborn Street. It was my fortress, my haven. Now it was just a room filled with boxes. For the first few days, I did nothing. I just sat at my desk, running my hand over the worn oak, staring at the Tiffany lamp Eleanor had bought me for my 40th birthday. I felt a profound, crushing sense of defeat. I was 66. My wife was gone. My career was over, ending not with a quiet fade out, but with a public execution. What was left? I was an archivist. My entire life had been about preservation, and I had failed to preserve the one thing that mattered most. The turning point came on a Tuesday. I was packing up my personal library, the scent of old paper and binding glue thick in the air. I reached for a heavy, leather-bound volume from a high shelf, a complete atlas of Cook County from 1891. It was a beautiful, oversized book, filled with intricate plat maps detailing every single parcel of land in the city just before the Columbian Exposition. As I lifted it, it slipped from my grasp, thudding heavily onto my desk and falling open. A single folded piece of paper, brittle with age, fluttered out from between the pages and drifted to the floor. I bent down to pick it up, my knees creaking in protest. I assumed it was an old bookmark or a forgotten note. I unfolded it carefully. It wasn't a bookmark. It was a quitclaim deed, handwritten in elegant, looping cursive, dated 1894. My archivist's brain, dormant for days under a fog of grief, flickered to life. A quitclaim deed transfers property interest. This one was for the very parcel of land on which the Marquette building now stood. The grantor was a man named Silas Croft, and the grantee was the city of Chicago. But it was the language of the deed that made me stop breathing. It wasn't a standard sale. It contained a restrictive covenant, a clause I had to read 3 times to fully comprehend. The deed stipulated that the land was being transferred to the city for a nominal fee under the express condition that it, and any structure subsequently built upon it, shall be used in perpetuity for the civic, cultural, and educational enrichment of the people of Chicago, and shall not be sold, leased, or otherwise conveyed for private or commercial enterprise. Perpetuity. The word echoed in the silent room. It meant forever. I stood there, the fragile document trembling in my hand. For decades, everyone had operated under the assumption that the state owned the building and the land beneath it outright. The state of Illinois had taken over management of the property from the city back in the 1970s during one of Chicago's many financial crises. But the original deed, the root of title, was with the city. And it came with a promise, written in iron gall ink over a century ago. A promise that made Governor Thorne's deal with Vanguard Development not just a betrayal, but an illegality. I quickly cross-referenced the deed in the official county recorder's database. It was there, logged and filed, but it was misindexed, buried under a slightly misspelled name, Silas Croft. A simple clerical error from 100 years ago had rendered it effectively invisible to modern title searches. Anyone looking for the Marquette property records would have found the 1970 state transfer agreement and stopped there, assuming it was the end of the line. No one would have thought to dig back further and search for a phantom deed from the 19th century. No one except a man who knew the old Atlases, who knew the old names, and who had just been given a reason to start digging. A slow, cold fire began to burn in my gut. This wasn't just a clue. It was a weapon. A very old, very sharp weapon. I thought of Governor Thorne's smug, triumphant face. I thought of Preston Holloway's smirk. They thought they were dealing with a harmless old man they could just sweep aside. They had bulldozed my life's work, but in their arrogance, they had missed the foundation. They had forgotten that before you build something new, you have to understand the ground you're building on. And I knew the history of that ground better than anyone alive. I carefully placed the deed in a protective mylar sleeve and locked it in my briefcase. I walked out of my office, leaving the half-packed boxes behind. My retirement was no longer a sad, quiet affair. It was now a declaration of war. My first stop was not a law library or a newspaper office. It was the sub-basement archives of Chicago City Hall, a place even mustier and more forgotten than my own. I had a feeling Silas Croft had other secrets to tell, and I was suddenly a very patient listener. This governor wanted to erase history. I was about to use it to erase him. The sub-basement of City Hall was a labyrinth of steel shelving and cardboard boxes, smelling of damp concrete and decaying paper. It was the city's memory hole, a place where inconvenient records and forgotten bureaucratic paper trails went to die. But for me, it was a hunting ground. Over the next 3 weeks, I became a ghost in the machine of Chicago's bureaucracy. I cashed in on 40 years of quiet favors owed to me by city clerks, county recorders, and librarians, the forgotten foot soldiers of public service. I told them I was working on a personal research project, a book on 19th century philanthropy. They gave me access without question. I was Arthur Pendleton, the harmless old archivist. It was the perfect cover. The name Silas Croft became my obsession. Using the deed as my starting point, I began to reconstruct his life, not through grand biographies, but through the mundane paper trail every person leaves behind. Tax ledgers, probate court records, building permits, census data. A picture emerged of a deeply private, deeply religious man. A teetotaler who made a fortune in timber and land speculation and was horrified by the Gilded Age excess and corruption he saw erupting around him. He had no children, and his will, which I found in the Cook County Probate Archives, left his entire fortune to various civic and charitable causes. He was exactly the sort of man who would put a perpetuity clause in a deed. A man trying to impose his morality on the future from beyond the grave. But the real discovery wasn't about Croft. It was about the land around the Marquette building. As I traced the ownership of the adjacent parcels, a pattern began to emerge, faint at first, then undeniable. One name kept appearing in the transfer records from the late 1980s and early 1990s. North Star Holdings, LLC. It was a ghost corporation. It bought up small, disparate properties, a hot dog stand, a parking garage, a failing print shop, all on the same block as the Marquette. It paid just over market value and then for decades did nothing with them. They just sat there, generating minimal income, a bizarrely dormant real estate portfolio that my heart hammered in my chest. This felt like something. Shell corporations weren't invented for legitimate business. I spent a week trying to pierce North Star's corporate veil. The public records were a dead end, listing only a registered agent in Delaware. It was a classic black box. This is where I knew I was out of my depth. I was an archivist. I could find the past, but I didn't know how to untangle the deliberate legal obfuscations of the present. I needed help. But I couldn't go to the press or a lawyer. Not yet. The deed was my atomic bomb. I only had one, and I had to be sure I was dropping it on the right target at the right time. Announcing it prematurely would give Thorne and his people time to bury it in lawsuits, to find a loophole, to corrupt a judge. I needed more. I needed to connect North Star Holdings to Governor Wallace Thorne. I thought about who Thorne was 25, 30 years ago. Back then, he wasn't a governor. He was a ruthless, ambitious real estate attorney at the powerful Chicago law firm of Massey, Klein and Associates. It was a long shot, but I requested the archived case files for the firm from the 1990s, held at the University of Chicago's Special Collections Library. I claimed my research on Silas. Croft had led me to an interest in late 20th century zoning law. Again, my harmless reputation preceded me. The librarian, a former student of mine, was happy to help. It took me 4 days, sifting through thousands of pages of mind-numbing legal documents. My eyes burned from staring at microfilm. My back ached. And then I found it. It was a single line in the billing records for a zoning variance. Case in 1992. The client was North Star Holdings. The attorney who signed the engagement letter and handled the filings. A junior partner at the time. Wallace Thorne. I felt a jolt, a pure, unadulterated shot of adrenaline. I had him. Thorne, as a young lawyer, had set up the Shell Corporation. He was the architect of this entire scheme. For 30 years, he had been playing the long game, slowly, patiently acquiring the land around the Marquette building, knowing that the block would be worthless for a major development as long as the historic landmark was in the way. The entire Illinois Heritage Initiative, his championing of my work, his promises of funding, it was all a monstrous, brilliant lie. It was a public relations campaign designed to build up the value and importance of the building in the public eye, only so he could be seen as the fiscally responsible leader making the tough choice to tear it down. He wasn't just clearing the way for his friend Preston Holloway. He was clearing the way for a project he had secretly assembled over the course of his entire career. He had been buying the ammunition for 30 years, and then he'd handed me the gun and made me point it at my own head. Now I understood the true scope of his arrogance. He was so sure of his power, so convinced that the past was just a pile of dusty papers no one cared about, that he never imagined someone like me would go digging. He saw me as a prop, and in doing so, he overlooked the one man on Earth who knew exactly where to find the bodies he buried. While I was unearthing Thorne's history, he was busy cementing his future. He was everywhere. On television, cutting ribbons at new factories. On the radio, talking about his tough-on-crime initiatives. His approval ratings were soaring. He was the charismatic, decisive leader Illinois had been waiting for. News stories about the Marquette demolition now framed it as a bold move for Chicago's economy. Preston Holloway's company, Vanguard, released a glossy architectural rendering of the new tower, a soulless shard of glass and steel called Thorne Tower. They were naming the damn thing after him. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was breathtaking. He seemed utterly untouchable. He had the media, the money, the political machinery, and the law on his side. He was a sitting governor, protected by a phalanx of aides, lawyers, and state troopers. Marcus Cole, his chief of staff, was known as the most effective and feared political operator in Springfield. They were an impregnable fortress. And what did I have? A brittle 100-year-old deed, a 30-year-old billing record, and a Social Security check. The imbalance was comical. Any sane man would have given up, taken the pension, and faded away. But I wasn't just any man. I was an archivist. And I knew that fortresses like empires always fall. And they almost always fall from within. As I sat in the university library, the evidence spread out before me, I thought of Eleanor. She had faced her own impossible battle with a quiet, unshakable dignity. She never gave in to despair. In her final days, she told me, "Arthur, don't you ever let them make you feel small." Right then, Governor Thorne and his cronies saw me as a speck of dust, an irrelevant old man to be swept into a dustpan and discarded. The thought didn't make me sad anymore. It made me angry. It was a righteous, clarifying anger that burned away all the fear and doubt. This was no longer just about a building. It was about my life, my wife's memory, and the very idea that truth matters. It was about the promise made by a man named Silas Croft in 1894, a promise I now felt a sacred duty to uphold. They had publicly humiliated me. They had destroyed my legacy. Now I was going to use their own history to dismantle their future, piece by meticulous piece. I packed my briefcase, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. I knew my next step. The time for hiding in archives was over. It was time to find an ally, someone young, hungry, and with a platform to shout the truth from the rooftops. I needed a journalist. And I knew exactly who to call. Finding the right journalist was like selecting the right tool for a delicate restoration project. I couldn't go to the established veterans at the Tribune or the Sun-Times. They were too cozy with the political establishment, too reliant on access to the governor's office. Their editors would likely kill the story, spooked by Thorne's power and the threat of a multi-million-dollar libel suit from Vanguard Development. I needed an outsider, someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain. I needed someone who saw journalism not as a career, but as a crusade. My search led me to an independent online news outlet called the Chicago Sentinel. It was little more than a blog, run out of a cramped office in the West Loop, but it had a reputation for dogged, investigative work that the mainstream papers were too timid to touch. Its lead reporter and founder was a woman named Maya Singh. She was in her late 20s, sharp, and had a well-earned reputation for being a bulldog. A year prior, she had broken a city council bribery scandal that had led to 2 indictments. She was fearless, and more importantly, she was hungry. I called the number on the Sentinel's website. A young, energetic voice answered. "Sentinel, Maya speaking." "Miss Singh," I said, my own voice sounding frail and old by comparison. "My name is Arthur Pendleton. I believe I have a story for you." There was a pause on the line. The archivist? From the Marquette building? She knew who I was. Of course she did. The very same, I said. I have some information regarding Governor Thorne and the Vanguard Tower project. Information that has been overlooked. It's sensitive. I'd prefer to meet in person. Another pause, this one charged with professional curiosity. Mr. Pendleton, with all due respect, I've received a dozen calls from people with conspiracy theories about that deal. What makes yours different? Because, I said, choosing my words carefully, I don't have theories. I have primary source documents. That got her attention. We agreed to meet the next day at a neutral location, the Newberry Library, a privately endowed research library on the near north side. It was my turf, a place of quiet scholarship, far from the prying eyes of City Hall or the State of Illinois building. I arrived early and sat in the grand hushed reading room, my briefcase on my lap. Maya arrived exactly on time. She was smaller than I'd pictured, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She carried herself with an air of restless energy that was the complete antithesis of my own deliberate calm. She sat down opposite me, pulled out a reporter's notebook and a pen, and said, "Okay, Mr. Pendleton, show me what you've got." I didn't speak at first. I simply opened my briefcase, took out the mylar-sleeved quitclaim deed from 1894, and slid it across the polished oak table. She picked it up, her eyebrows knitting together as she read the elegant, archaic script. She read it once, then a second time, her eyes widening slightly as she lingered on the restrictive covenant. In perpetuity, she whispered, more to herself than to me, "Shall not be sold. For private or commercial enterprise." She looked up at me, the full implication of the document dawning on her. "Is this real?" "It is," I confirmed. Authenticated and cross-referenced with the official county record, which was misindexed for the last 100 years. Legally, the governor's deal with Vanguard is built on a foundation of sand. The state doesn't have the right to sell that land for commercial development. It never did. Her professional skepticism warred with the explosive potential of the document in her hand. This is a bombshell. But their lawyers will fight it. They'll argue the covenant is obsolete, unenforceable. Which is why it's not enough, I interrupted gently. I then laid out the next piece of evidence, the photocopied billing records from Massey, Klein and Associates, showing Wallace Thorne as the attorney of record for the creation of North Star Holdings. I explained how the Shell Corporation had spent years acquiring the surrounding properties. I walked her through the timeline, showing how Thorne had masterfully orchestrated the entire affair over 3 decades, culminating in his own self-serving decision as governor. I wasn't just giving her a legal story about an old deed. I was giving her a political story about profound, long-term corruption. Maya listened intently, her pen flying across the page. She peppered me with sharp, insightful questions. She challenged my assumptions. She played devil's advocate. I answered each question calmly, factually, providing the document number, the date, the archival source for every claim I made. This was the language I knew, the language of evidence. By the end of our 2-hour meeting, her skepticism had evaporated, replaced by a cold, simmering anger that mirrored my own. "He played everyone," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "He used his public office to enrich himself on a scheme he started as a private attorney 30 years ago. He's been hiding in plain sight the entire time. He is arrogant," I said. "He believes he's the smartest man in any room. And he believes that people like me, people who care about history, are sentimental old fools who don't matter." Maya looked at me, a new respect. In her eyes, "He's about to find out how wrong he is." That meeting was the beginning of our strange and powerful alliance. The old archivist and the young muckraker. We became a 2-person army. I was the researcher, the mole. I continued to spend my days in the dusty archives, using my institutional knowledge and my harmless reputation to dig deeper. Maya was the strategist, the voice. She knew how to shape a narrative, how to build pressure, how to corner a target. We decided to escalate the war slowly, methodically. A war of 1,000 cuts. Maya's first article for the Sentinel wasn't about the deed. That was our trump card, and it was too early to play it. Instead, she published a piece about Northstar Holdings, simply asking the question, who owns the block around the Marquette building? It was a masterpiece of innuendo and carefully sourced facts. She detailed the mysterious LLC's decades-long acquisition of the properties, pointing out the oddity of a portfolio that had remained dormant for so long. She didn't mention Thorne's name, not once. She didn't have to. She simply ended the article by asking why the governor's office had shown no curiosity about the true ownership of the land adjacent to their billion-dollar development project. The article was a small stone tossed into a large pond, but the ripples were immediate. Other, larger news outlets, smelling a potential story, picked it up. Suddenly, Northstar Holdings was a name being whispered in the halls of power in Springfield. Thorne's office issued a terse, dismissive statement. The governor's focus is on the thousands of jobs the Vanguard Tower will create for the people of Illinois. The ownership of neighboring private properties is not our concern. It was the exact arrogant, dismissive response we had hoped for. They weren't taking it seriously. They still saw it as a minor annoyance. Meanwhile, I was feeding Maya more ammunition. I found evidence of a zoning change Northstar had applied for in the mid-90s. A change that would have been insignificant at the time, but was crucial for the height and scale of the proposed Thorne Tower. The zoning board commissioner who approved it was a man named Richard Pace, who, just 2 years later, was appointed by the then newly elected state Senator Wallace Thorne to a lucrative position on the Illinois Commerce Commission. It was circumstantial, but it was another piece of the puzzle. Maya published a second article, this time connecting the dots between the zoning change, Richard Pace, and then Senator Thorne. The narrative was building. We weren't just alleging corruption now. We were showing the pattern, the network of patronage that Thorne had built over his entire career. The governor's office responded more forcefully this time. His press secretary held a conference calling the Sentinel a disreputable blog engaging in baseless smears, and accusing Maya of having a political vendetta. Governor Thorne himself, when ambushed by reporters, laughed it off. "This is what happens when you try to make real change," he said with his trademark charismatic smile. "The forces of the status quo, the cynics, they come out of the woodwork with their ridiculous conspiracy theories. I'm not going to be distracted. We are building the future." He still felt untouchable, but I could feel a subtle shift in the current. He was on the defensive. He was being forced to react. He had no idea where the information was coming from, which meant he didn't know how much more there was. We had him spooked. And that's when his people made their first mistake. They stopped ignoring me and started paying attention. One evening, as I was leaving the Newberry Library, a large black sedan pulled up beside me. The back window rolled down, and I saw the cold, dead eyes of Marcus Cole, the governor's chief of staff. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, his voice smooth and menacing. "Get in. The governor would like a word." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of old bones. Getting into a car with Marcus Cole felt like stepping into my own grave. But I knew that showing fear would be a fatal mistake. They saw me as weak. I had to prove them wrong. I straightened my back, met his gaze, and said calmly, "I'm afraid I'm rather busy, Mr. Cole." A flicker of surprise, or perhaps annoyance, crossed his face. That wasn't a request. He didn't need to say more. The implication hung in the cool evening air. I was a 66-year-old man on a quiet street. He was the right hand of the most powerful man in the state. I gave a slight, resigned nod, opened the door, and slid onto the plush leather seat. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, gliding through the streets of Chicago. We drove in silence for several minutes, the tension in the small space thick enough to choke on. Cole stared straight ahead, his hands clasped in his lap. He was a creature of absolute stillness, a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The car didn't go to the governor's office or the mansion. Instead, it took us to a construction site, the Marquette Block. The area was already fenced off. The smaller buildings that Northstar Holdings had acquired now hollowed out shells awaiting the wrecking ball. In the center of it all stood my building, dark and silent, a grand old lady on death row. The car stopped, and Cole gestured for me to get out. Governor Wallace Thorne was standing there, silhouetted against the chain-link fence, staring up at the building. He wasn't wearing his usual perfectly tailored suit. He was in a cashmere overcoat, his silver hair ruffled by the wind coming off the lake. He looked less like a politician and more like a king surveying a newly conquered territory. He turned as I approached, his face unreadable in the twilight. "Arthur," he said, his voice devoid of its usual folksy charm. It was flat, cold steel. "Thank you for joining me." "I was under the impression I didn't have a choice," I replied, my own voice steadier than I felt. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "There are always choices, Arthur. You've simply been making the wrong ones lately." He gestured toward the Marquette. "Look at it. A beautiful old building. Full of memories, I'm sure. But its time is over. The city needs to grow, to evolve. That's progress. It's inevitable. You, of all people, as a historian, should understand that. I understand that history is full of men who confuse their own ambition with progress," I said. Thorne's eyes narrowed. The pretense of civility was gone. "Let's stop the games. I know you've been feeding that little blogger from the Sentinel. I don't know what scraps you think you've found, but I'm here to tell you to stop." "It's over, is it?" I asked. "What about Northstar Holdings? Is that over?" He actually chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. "You found that, did you? Impressive. For an old man." "Yes, I helped some clients set up a holding company 30 years ago. It's called being a lawyer. It's not a crime. It's certainly not a story. It's a story when that same lawyer becomes governor and hands a $1 billion state-subsidized development deal to a close friend that happens to benefit that same secret holding company," I shot back. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You have no proof of that. You have circumstantial nonsense. You are an old man with a grudge. A sad, pathetic figure clinging to a pile of bricks. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I have spent my entire life building my reputation, building this state. You are a footnote. Do you really want to spend your golden years, what little you have left of them, fighting a battle you cannot possibly win?" This was the moment. The point of no return. He was trying to intimidate me, to crush my spirit. He was counting on me to be the feeble old man he had cast me as. I looked from his arrogant face to the magnificent, doomed building behind him. I thought of Silas Croft's promise. I thought of Eleanor's courage. And I felt no fear at all. "You're right about one thing, Governor," I said quietly. "I am an old man, and I don't have that many years left, which means I have absolutely nothing to lose." I paused, letting the words sink in. "But you have everything to lose. Your office, your reputation, your legacy. This tower you want to name after yourself. And I promise you, I will spend every remaining day of my life dismantling it all, piece by piece, document by document. You think what I've given that reporter is all I have. You have no idea what's in the archives." It was a bluff, but a good one. His composure finally cracked. For a split second, I saw a flash of genuine fear in his eyes. The fear of the unknown. He had no idea what other secrets I might have unearthed from his long, dirty past. He had built his castle on a foundation of secrets and lies, and he had just realized that the castle's archivist was now the enemy at the gate. He recovered quickly, his face hardening into a mask of pure fury. "You will regret this, Pendleton," he hissed. "I will bury you. I will use the full power of this state to crush you and that pathetic little blog. I'll have you audited. I'll investigate your staff, your friends. I will find something. Everyone has something to hide. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd just taken your pension and faded away." He turned on his heel and strode back to the car without another word. Marcus Cole gave me one last, lingering look, a look that promised a world of pain, before following him. The black sedan pulled away, leaving me alone on the sidewalk, the wind whipping around me. The threat was clear. The war was no longer being fought with anonymous leaks and historical documents. It was personal now. He had declared total war on me, an old-age pensioner. I should have been terrified. But instead, I felt a strange sense of exhilaration. He had revealed his hand. He was a bully and a thug, wrapped in the flag in a tailored suit. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that he had just made the biggest mistake of his political life. He had threatened me directly. He had underestimated me. And he had confirmed that we were on the right track. As I stood there, watching his taillights disappear, I took out my phone. It was an old-style flip phone, but it had one feature I needed, a record button. I had recorded the entire conversation. Governor Thorne had just handed me the shovel to dig his own grave. I called Maya. "I've got him," I said, my voice shaking slightly, not with fear, but with triumph. "I've got him on tape." The recording was a game-changer. It was raw, ugly, and undeniable. Governor Thorne, the man of the people, threatening a senior citizen to protect his corrupt dealings. Maya and I listened to it together in her small, cluttered office, the governor's menacing words filling the silence. "He threatened to use the power of the state to crush you," Maya said, her eyes wide. "Abuse of power, witness intimidation. This is more than just a corruption story now. This is criminal." "He's desperate," I said. "He knows we have something, but he doesn't know what. He's a cornered animal." "And cornered animals are the most dangerous," she countered, pacing the small room. "We have to be smart about this. We can't just release the tape. His office will claim it's doctored, taken out of context. They'll use their media machine to discredit it, before it even gets traction. This has to be the final nail in the coffin, not just another blow." She was right. The tape was our checkmate move, but we had to set up the board perfectly before we made it. We needed to escalate the pressure, to force him into a position where he couldn't deny the tape's authenticity. Our strategy shifted. We moved from exposing the past to weaponizing the present. Our first move was to go after his partner, Preston Holloway and Vanguard Development. I went back to the archives, but this time I wasn't looking at 19th century deeds. I was digging into Vanguard's other public projects. I spent a week cross-referencing building permits, state contracts, and campaign finance disclosures. The pattern was disgustingly clear. Over the past decade, Vanguard had been awarded 5 major state construction contracts. In each case, their bid was not the lowest. And in the 6 months prior to each contract being awarded, shell corporations linked to Holloway had made substantial, legally gray donations to political action committees controlled by Wallace Thorne. It was a classic pay-to-play scheme, hidden in plain sight. Maya took my research and worked her magic. She found a disgruntled former employee in Vanguard's accounting department who was willing to speak off the record, confirming that a political contingency fund was a standard part of their bidding process on state jobs. Her next article, Vanguard's Golden Touch, laid out the entire scheme in meticulous, undeniable detail. It directly implicated both Holloway and Thorne in a pattern of cronyism and corruption. This time, the story wasn't just on an independent blog. It was too big to ignore. The Tribune and the Sun-Times were forced to follow up. The story led the nightly news. The phrase "pay to play" was now permanently attached to the governor's name. The blowback was immediate and intense. Thorne's office went into full crisis mode. They held press conferences denying everything, calling it a politically motivated smear campaign. Marcus Cole, looking haggard and furious, announced that Vanguard Development was filing a massive defamation lawsuit against the Chicago Sentinel and Maya Singh personally. It was a classic SLAPP suit, a strategic lawsuit against public participation, designed not to win, but to intimidate and bankrupt a smaller opponent through crippling legal fees. They were trying to silence us, to bleed Maya dry. A wave of panic hit me. This was my fault. I had brought this down on her. I went to her office the day the lawsuit was announced, my heart heavy with guilt. I found her not in despair, but in a state of fierce combative energy. "They're suing us, Arthur," she said, a grin on her face. "Do you know what this means? It means we've got them on the ropes. This isn't a power move. It's a Hail Mary, and it's going to give us exactly what we need." "What are you talking about, Maya? They could ruin you." "No," she said, her eyes gleaming. "They've just opened the door to the discovery process. As part of our defense against their libel suit, my lawyers now have the right to subpoena their internal documents. Their emails, their financial records, all the things we couldn't get to. They think they're silencing us, but they've just handed us a search warrant." Her brilliance left me breathless. She had turned their greatest weapon back on them. The lawsuit was a godsend. While Maya's pro bono legal team from a First Amendment advocacy group began burying Vanguard in discovery requests, I turned my attention back to the original sin, the Marquette building. It was time to play our trump card. It was time to release the deed. We didn't give it to the press. We went straight to the Illinois Attorney General. I filed a formal complaint on behalf of the people of Chicago, citing the 1894 quitclaim deed and its restrictive covenant. I attached a notarized affidavit detailing how I found the deed and an expert opinion from a respected legal historian at the University of Chicago confirming its likely validity. We were no longer just journalists and sources. We were now formal complainants in an official legal process. The AG's office, which was run by a member of the opposing political party and no friend to Governor Thorne, had no choice but to open an official investigation. The headline was devastating for the governor: Attorney General investigating legality of Thorne Tower deal. The story of the century-old deed and Silas Croft's promise was suddenly everywhere. It was a narrative the public could understand, a rich man's dying wish to protect his city's heritage being trampled on by a corrupt modern-day politician. I was asked to appear on television. I, Arthur Pendleton, who had never been comfortable speaking to more than 3 people at a time, found myself sitting under hot studio lights, telling the story of the deed to a statewide audience. I simply told the truth, my voice calm and measured. I wasn't an activist. I was an archivist, and my only goal was to ensure a promise made in 1894 was honored in the present day. The combined pressure from Maya's reporting, the Vanguard lawsuit's discovery process, and the Attorney General's investigation was creating a perfect storm. Thorne was embattled, his approval ratings plummeting. He was being attacked on all fronts. He grew increasingly erratic and defensive in public appearances. He looked tired. He looked trapped. The breaking point came from Maya's legal team. In the mountain of documents they subpoenaed from Vanguard, they found it. A single, damning email. It was from Preston Holloway to his personal financial advisor, sent the day after the Thorne Tower deal was announced. It read, Time to transfer the 15% interest in North Star to the Shepherd's Trust as agreed. Make sure it's clean. Maya brought the email to me, her hands trembling with excitement. We need to know what the Shepherd's Trust is, she said. I knew that name. It tickled a remote corner of my memory. I spent an entire night combing through old society pages and philanthropic reports. And then I found it. The Shepherd's Trust was a blind trust established in the name of Governor Thorne's late mother. Her maiden name was Shepherd. It was his personal, hidden family trust. We had it all. The email proving his financial stake in North Star Holdings. The billing records proving he created the company. And the tape of him threatening me to cover it all up. All the pieces were finally in place. It's time, I said to Maya. It's time to end this. She nodded, her face grimly determined. We're not just publishing this, Arthur. We're going to do it right in his own house. The Illinois State Legislature had called a special oversight hearing to question the governor about the mounting scandals. He had agreed to appear, hoping to use the public forum to defiantly clear his name. The hearing was scheduled to be broadcast live on statewide television in 2 days. He thinks it's his stage, Maya said, a predatory glint in her eye. Let's make it his scaffold. The chamber of the Illinois House of Representatives in Springfield was packed. Every seat was filled with legislators, aides, and a swarm of journalists who smelled blood in the water. The air crackled with anticipation. It felt less like a legislative hearing and more like a public trial. I sat in the front row of the public gallery, a quiet, gray-haired man in an ill-fitting suit, completely invisible amidst the chaos. Maya was in the press section, her laptop open, her expression a mask of calm focus. She gave me a single, brief nod. It was time. Governor Wallace Thorne entered the chamber like a prize fighter entering the ring. He was all confidence and righteous indignation, shaking hands with his political allies, smiling for the cameras, projecting an aura of a man wrongly accused and eager for vindication. He sat at the witness table, flanked by Marcus Cole and a team of expensive-looking lawyers. He placed his hands on the table, leaned into the microphone, and declared he was ready to answer any and all questions to put these baseless, politically motivated smears to rest. The hearing began. For the first hour, it was pure political theater. Thorne's allies on the committee tossed him softball questions, which he hit out of the park with his practiced, charismatic sincerity. He painted himself as a victim, a reformer attacked by entrenched interests, and a reckless, irresponsible blogger. He was good. I had to admit it. He was charming, persuasive, and he was winning over the room. He dismissed the North Star Holdings connection as ancient history. He painted the Vanguard contracts as standard business. He was weaving a narrative of competence and integrity, and it was working. Then, it was the turn of the opposition party's ranking member, a tough, no-nonsense state senator from Chicago named Elena Ramirez. She had been one of Maya's quiet, off-the-record sources for weeks. She held a copy of the Sentinel article in her hand. "Governor," she began, her voice cutting through the chamber's murmur, "let's talk about North Star Holdings. You claim it was simply a legal entity you helped clients form 30 years ago. Is it your sworn testimony that you have had no financial interest in or connection to that company since that time?" "That is correct, Senator," Thorne said smoothly, looking her right in the eye. "Absolutely none." A clear, unequivocal lie. Under oath. Senator Ramirez paused, letting the lie hang in the air. At that exact moment, across the city and the state, every journalist and political operative received an email alert. It was from the Chicago Sentinel. The subject line was a single word: proof. The email contained a link to a new article on Maya's website. The headline read, "Governor Thorne's Secret Stake in Thorne Tower." The article contained a scanned image of Preston Holloway's email about the Shepherd's Trust, and a detailed explanation of the trust's connection to Thorne's family. In the chamber, Phones began to buzz. A collective gasp went through the press section as reporters saw the story break in real time. Marcus Cole's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at it, and the color drained from his face. He frantically slid the phone in front of Thorne. The governor looked down, his eyes scanning the screen. His confident smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of sheer panic. He looked up, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Senator Ramirez held up her own tablet, displaying the article. "Governor, I'd like to draw your attention to a story that has just been published. It contains an email from Preston Holloway discussing the transfer of a 15% interest in North Star Holdings to something called the Shepherds Trust. Can you please tell this committee what the Shepherds Trust is?" Thorne was speechless. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His lawyers whispered furiously to him. The chamber was in an uproar. I am not aware of any such trust," he finally stammered, his voice suddenly weak. "Another lie. You're not aware of a trust named after your own mother?" Ramirez pressed, her voice dripping with ice. Thorne was unraveling. The camera zoomed in on his face, beads of sweat forming on his brow. This is a fabrication. A forgery. This is a despicable attack on my family. This was the moment we were waiting for. Maya gave me the signal. I stood up from my seat in the gallery. I wasn't supposed to speak. Public comment wasn't on the agenda. But I didn't care. I held up my old simple flip phone. "He is lying," I said, my voice echoing in the suddenly silent chamber. Every head turned towards me. Thorne stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. "I have proof he is lying." The committee chairman banged his gavel. "The gentleman in the gallery is out of order." But it was too late. I pressed the play button on my phone, and from its tiny, tinny speaker, the governor's own voice filled the grand hall, cold and menacing. "You will regret this, Pendleton. I will bury you. I will use the full power of this state to crush you. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd just taken your pension and faded away." I let the entire recording play. The threats, the intimidation, the raw, undisguised voice of a corrupt tyrant. When it finished, a profound, tomb-like silence fell over the room. No one moved. No one spoke. The entire state of Illinois had just heard the true voice of their governor. Wallace Thorne sat there, utterly broken. The charismatic mask was gone, shattered into a million pieces. All that was left was a hollowed-out old man, exposed and ruined under the glare of the television lights. He stared at me, his eyes filled not with anger anymore, but with a kind of blank, defeated horror. He had built his empire on secrets, but it was his own voice that had brought it crashing down. The chairman banged his gavel again, his face ashen, and called for a recess. But we all knew it was over. It wasn't a recess. It was an execution. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I didn't need to. I turned and walked out of the chamber, my heart calm and steady. I had done what I had set out to do. I had preserved the promise. As I walked down the marble steps of the Capitol building, I felt the cool afternoon sun on my face. For the first time in a long time, it felt like a new beginning. The aftermath was a political avalanche. Governor Thorne resigned in disgrace less than 48 hours after the hearing. The U.S. Attorney's Office launched a federal investigation into his activities, and a month later, both he and Preston Holloway were indicted on multiple counts of racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Marcus Cole, in a bid for a lighter sentence, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, detailing decades of Thorne's corruption. The great man, the untouchable titan of Illinois politics, was reduced to a booking photo and a line in a court docket. Thorne Tower, of course, was never built. Vanguard Development declared bankruptcy amidst the scandal and the mountain of lawsuits. The defamation suit against Maya was dropped. Her little blog, the Chicago Sentinel, became one of the most respected independent news sources in the country. And she won a Pulitzer Prize the following year for her reporting. And the Marquette Building? It was saved. The Attorney General used my research and the original deed to nullify the state's agreement with Vanguard. A new civic trust was formed, flush with donations from citizens and philanthropists inspired by the story. They raised enough money to not only complete the restoration I had dreamed of for 40 years, but to endow its future operations. They asked me to come back to oversee the project, to reclaim my old office. I politely declined. My work there was done. I had fought my war, and I had won. Retirement, this time on my own terms, felt right. I still visit the building, of course. I walk through its magnificent rotunda, now gleaming and fully restored, and watch the school children on tours staring up at the Tiffany mosaics with wide, wondering eyes. They put up a small, discreet plaque near the entrance, next to a portrait of a stern-looking man with a formidable beard. It tells the story of Silas Croft and his perpetual gift to the people of Chicago. My name is not on it. I insisted on that. An archivist's work should be invisible. Only the story he preserves should remain. I live a quiet life now. I read. I tend to my small garden. I have coffee with Maya once a week. We never talk about Thorne. We don't have to. His spectacular downfall is a matter of public record, a permanent part of the state's history. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet, I take out the original quitclaim deed. I don't keep it in a mylar sleeve anymore. I had it framed, and it hangs on the wall in my study, a testament to a promise kept. Thorne was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He's an old man now, like me, but his days are measured by concrete walls and iron bars. His legacy is not a gleaming tower, but a synonym for disgrace. He tried to erase history, to bend it to his will. And in the end, history, in the form of a forgotten piece of paper and a stubborn old man, erased him. He built his entire world on the arrogant belief that the past was dead and buried. But he forgot the one thing every archivist knows is true. Nothing is ever truly gone. The end.